The last days of the war felt like the end of the world. German towns were burning, sirens screamed day and night, and every woman who had worn a uniform, nurses, clerks, radio operators, knew what capture would mean. Rumors moved faster than gunfire. They said the Americans tortured women. They said the Soviets didn't take prisoners at all. They said that once you were captured, you would never be seen again. So when Allied soldiers surrounded their column outside a shattered village in 1945, the women froze in silence. Some clutched photographs of their families. Others tore the insignia from their sleeves, trying to look like civilians. But it was too late. A young American officer stepped forward and shouted an order. Rifles were raised, not to fire, but to cover. The women dropped their bags, raised their hands, and waited for the end. They were taken to an open field and told to sit. An American medic moved down the line, checking wounds, giving water. The prisoners watched him, trembling, waiting for violence that never came. One woman later said, "We were ready for humiliation. Instead, they gave us bandages and chocolate." I didn't know whether to cry or run when night came. Trucks arrived to transport them. The guards handed out blankets. That small act, the rough wool against their skin, felt impossible. Why would the enemy give comfort to the defeated? They spent days traveling through ruined Germany. Every town they passed was a ghost. Civilians stared, some spat, others whispered curses. No one wanted to look at them. Women of the Reich, captured and disgraced. At each checkpoint, the same fear returned. What will they do to us? Will we be paraded through the streets? Will we vanish like the others? But the Americans were calm. They didn't touch them. They didn't scream or strike. They simply moved them along. Efficient, distant, professional. One woman noticed something that stayed with her forever. When an American soldier saw a crying child among the prisoners, he gave her his ration biscuit. No one had seen kindness like that in months. That evening, they were kept in a schoolhouse. Broken windows, cold floor, rain tapping on the roof. The women whispered to each other in the dark, "Maybe they're saving us for interrogation. Maybe for something worse." But instead of soldiers, nurses came. They spoke gently, though few could understand the words. They brought water, and even soap. Soap, the same thing German civilians hadn't seen in weeks. For the first time, the women realized that maybe their captors weren't monsters. Maybe there was still a world beyond ruins. Still, no one slept. Every sound, a door creak, a boot on the floor, made hearts race. They didn't believe safety existed. Not yet. The next morning, they were told they would be sent across the ocean. The words hit like a verdict. Across the ocean, to America. They didn't know it then, but that journey would lead them not to punishment, but to the most unexpected discovery of their lives. When the women heard they were being sent to America, a chill ran through the barracks. None of them really knew what that meant. To most, America was just a rumor. A distant enemy land filled with factories, skyscrapers, and monsters from propaganda films. It was the land that dropped fire from the sky. Now, they were being shipped there like ghosts. They were marched to a train station, quiet, gray, half destroyed. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. No one spoke. Boots scraped the ground, chains rattled. The wind hissed through broken windows. As the train moved through the countryside, they saw what had become of Germany. Entire towns flattened, bridges gone, villages silent except for crows. They pressed their faces to the glass and whispered to each other, We built all of this, and we destroyed it too. Days later, they reached a harbor. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen the ocean. Vast, cold, endless. Lined along the pier were American ships painted gray and marked with white stars. The women stared at them in silence. They expected cages, darkness, chains. Instead, they were led aboard in small groups. An American officer counted them, checked their names, and handed each woman a small tag with a number. Then came the shock. They were given bunks, blankets, and food. A bowl of soup, bread with butter, even coffee. Real coffee. Something no one in Germany had tasted since before the war. It was bitter, but warm. Some cried while drinking it. The American sailors were young, many barely older than the women themselves. They didn't yell or threaten. They smiled awkwardly, offered cigarettes, and sometimes tried to say, "Hello." At first, the women ignored them. It felt wrong to smile back at the enemy. But slowly, suspicion turned to curiosity. One nurse whispered, "They don't look like demons." Another replied, "No, they look like boys." At night, the ship swayed softly on the Atlantic waves. The prisoners huddled together in their bunks, whispering about what waited for them on the other side. Would they be imprisoned forever? Used for propaganda? Or worse, forgotten completely? No one knew. After 2 weeks at sea, someone shouted, "Land!" They rushed to the deck and saw it, the coastline of the United States. Clean, green, untouched by war. Harbors full of cranes and trucks, not ruins. Smoke from factories, not bombs. It was like stepping into another world. They disembarked under guard, expecting hostility, jeers, curses, maybe stones. But the dock workers just stared with mild curiosity. To the Americans, these women weren't enemies anymore. They were just people from a lost war. They were loaded onto buses that would take them inland to the camps. The windows were clean, the seats soft, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline and soap. Outside, everything looked impossibly normal. Children playing in parks, families walking dogs, people laughing. One of the women pressed her hand to the window and whispered, "They live like this, even during war." For the first time since surrendering, a strange feeling crept in. Envy mixed with disbelief. They had grown up hearing that the Allies were barbarians, slaves to chaos and greed. But here was order, comfort, and peace. A world that seemed untouched by the darkness that had consumed Europe. That evening, as the buses stopped, the women saw tall fences, rows of white barracks, and lights glowing softly in the dusk. A wooden sign read simply, "Prisoner of War Camp, United States Army." They were home to their new prison, one unlike anything they had imagined. And before the week was over, they would discover something even more impossible. Not fear, not punishment, but dignity. When the women heard they were being sent to America, a chill ran through the barracks. None of them really knew what that meant. To most, America was just a rumor, a distant enemy land filled with factories, skyscrapers, and monsters from propaganda films. It was the land that dropped fire from the sky. Now, they were being shipped there like ghosts. They were marched to a train station, quiet, gray, half destroyed. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. No one spoke. Boots scraped the ground, chains rattled, the wind hissed through broken windows. As the train moved through the countryside, they saw what had become of Germany. Entire towns flattened, bridges gone, villages silent except for crows. They pressed their faces to the glass and whispered to each other, "We built all of this, and we destroyed it too." Days later, they reached a harbor. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen the ocean. Vast, cold, endless. Lined along the pier were American ships painted gray and marked with white stars. The women stared at them in silence. They expected cages, darkness, chains. Instead, they were led aboard in small groups. An American officer counted them, checked their names, and handed each woman a small tag with a number. Then came the shock. They were given bunks, blankets, and food. A bowl of soup, bread with butter, even coffee. Real coffee. Something no one in Germany had tasted since before the war. It was bitter, but warm. Some cried while drinking it. The American sailors were young, many barely older than the women themselves. They didn't yell or threaten. They smiled awkwardly, offered cigarettes, and sometimes tried to say, "Hello." At first, the women ignored them. It felt wrong to smile back at the enemy. But slowly, suspicion turned to curiosity. One nurse whispered, "They don't look like demons." Another replied, "No, they look like boys." At night, the ship swayed softly on the Atlantic waves. The prisoners huddled together in their bunks, whispering about what waited for them on the other side. Would they be imprisoned forever? Used for propaganda? Or worse, forgotten completely? No one knew. After 2 weeks at sea, someone shouted, "Land!" They rushed to the deck and saw it, the coastline of the United States. Clean, green, untouched by war. Harbors full of cranes and trucks, not ruins. Smoke from factories, not bombs. It was like stepping into another world. They disembarked under guard, expecting hostility, jeers, curses, maybe stones. But the dock workers just stared with mild curiosity. To the Americans, these women weren't enemies anymore. They were just people from a lost war. They were loaded onto buses that would take them inland to the camps. The windows were clean, the seats soft, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline and soap. Outside, everything looked impossibly normal. Children playing in parks, families walking dogs, people laughing. One of the women pressed her hand to the window and whispered, "They live like this, even during war." For the first time since surrendering, a strange feeling crept in. Envy mixed with disbelief. They had grown up hearing that the Allies were barbarians, slaves to chaos and greed. But here was order, comfort, and peace. A world that seemed untouched by the darkness that had consumed Europe. That evening, as the buses stopped, the women saw tall fences, rows of white barracks, and lights glowing softly in the dusk. A wooden sign read simply, "Prisoner of War Camp, United States Army." They were home to their new prison, one unlike anything they had imagined. And before the week was over, they would discover something even more impossible. Not fear, not punishment, but dignity. The days that followed felt like waking from a nightmare. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the barracks windows, glinting off clean metal cups and neatly folded blankets. The women still moved cautiously, half expecting the kindness to end. But it didn't. Everyday routines were simple but surreal. Breakfast at 7, showers open twice a day, laundry on Thursdays. They even received bars of soap, one per person, stamped with U.S. Army, and towels that smelled faintly of detergent and summer air. For women who had spent months hiding in basements, running from bombs, or living without soap, these small things felt almost sacred. "I held the soap in my hands for a long time," one prisoner remembered. It was warm from the sun. I couldn't stop touching it. After days of washing and rest, they began to look different. Faces once gray with exhaustion now showed color again. Hair, once tangled and greasy, was brushed and tied back. The Americans even brought mirrors. Small, square, scratched, but mirrors nonetheless. When the women saw their reflections for the first time, they froze. They didn't recognize themselves. One whispered, "I look alive again." Another laughed softly and said, "I had forgotten my own face." They weren't soldiers anymore. They weren't symbols of a lost war. They were women again, tired, scarred, but alive. The camp had its own rhythm now. Mornings smelled of coffee and bread, afternoons of soap and drying laundry. The sound of buckets, laughter, and running water echoed between barracks. To outsiders, it might have seemed ordinary, but to these women, it was everything. "We learned to feel proud of being clean," one recalled later. "For years we were taught that only victory mattered. But here, we discovered that dignity mattered more." They began to polish their shoes, tidy their bunks, braid each other's hair, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they wanted to. It was the first sign that they were healing. The women who ran the infirmary were mostly young American nurses. They smiled easily, spoke gently, and never raised their voices. They checked fevers, changed dressings, and offered words that sounded foreign but kind. One nurse named Mary became a quiet legend in the camp. She spoke a few words of German, enough to make the prisoners laugh when she mispronounced them. She would bring small things, buttons, ribbons, sometimes even lipstick left behind by other nurses. When she handed one woman a small red lipstick, the prisoner burst into tears. "I hadn't seen a color like that in years," she later wrote. "It was like holding a piece of life." War had stripped them of softness, of the right to feel beautiful or safe. But in that camp, surrounded by fences and strangers, they began to rediscover it. They laughed quietly at night, swapped stories, taught each other songs. One woman stitched a small flower onto her pillowcase with thread from her uniform. Another braided her friend's hair every morning, saying, "We must look like women again, not ghosts." Even the guards noticed the change. An American sergeant said later, "At first they looked like shadows, but after a few weeks, they started to smile." Soap, water, clean clothes. They weren't luxuries. They were reminders of what the war had taken away. Every small act of normalcy was a quiet rebellion against the chaos they had survived. And though they still wore prisoner tags, the women began to feel something they hadn't felt in years: self-worth. "They didn't give us freedom," one wrote, "but they gave us back our reflection." Days in the American camp began with a whistle, not a shout. The sun rose over the fences and the women lined up for roll call, tired but calm. There was no barking of orders, no slaps, no chaos. The guards counted quietly, marked their lists, and said, "Good morning." It felt strange every single time. They were still prisoners, but life had rhythm again. And that rhythm, food, work, rest, began to heal something inside them. Breakfast smelled of coffee, oatmeal, and fresh bread. They sat in long rows at wooden tables, eating in silence at first, then slowly. Voices began to rise. Laughter began to return. They learned to say thank you in English, awkwardly, shyly, but the guards always smiled back. One woman later said, "It was the first word I learned in America. Thank you. Because every day I had something to thank them for." After breakfast, each group went to their assigned duties. Some helped in the kitchen, Others worked in the laundry or garden. It wasn't forced labor, it was activity, purpose. The Americans even paid them a few cents per day, which could be spent at the camp canteen. There, for the first time, they saw things they hadn't imagined existed anymore. Soap, brushes, sewing kits, and small bars of chocolate. Every corner of the camp was organized, paths swept, flowers planted near the infirmary, laundry hung in perfect lines. The Americans cared about order, and soon the women did too. One day, an officer came by to inspect and found a group of women tending a small garden outside their barracks. When he asked who told them to plant it, they answered, "No one. We wanted something alive to look at." He simply nodded and smiled. That evening, the guards brought over packets of seeds, carrots, lettuce, daisies. It wasn't much, but it felt like a gift. "They gave us Earth," one woman later said. "After years of destruction, we were growing something again." At first, the guards kept their distance. They were young men who had fought against everything these women represented. But as weeks passed, something changed. They began to exchange small gestures, a cigarette, a joke, a smile. Some guards tried to learn German phrases, often mispronouncing them so badly that everyone laughed. The laughter broke the invisible wall between enemies. An American guard wrote in his journal, "They remind me of my sisters back home. They've seen hell, but they're still polite, still proud." The women, in turn, began to see their captors not as conquerors, but as ordinary people, men who wrote letters home, who missed their families, who didn't seem to hate anyone. The Americans valued discipline, but also education. They set up small classes for English lessons, reading, and even sewing. For many women, it was the first time in years they touched a book. Some wrote in journals provided by the camp, describing their days, the smell of soap, the warmth of the sun, the laughter that now filled the air. "We live behind fences," one wrote, "but we live." Music became part of camp life, too. An American soldier played the harmonica in the evenings, and soon the women joined in with German folk songs. No one understood the words, but everyone understood the sound of peace. By autumn, the women no longer looked like prisoners. They smiled more, stood taller, braided each other's hair, and took pride in the small garden they had planted. They weren't free, but they were no longer broken. It felt as though the fences kept the world out, not us in, one woman recalled. At night, the guards walked their rounds while the women whispered stories under the dim barrack lights. Stories not of defeat, but of survival, of gratitude, and of the strange kindness of the enemy. The war had taken everything from them. But in this unlikely place, they found something no victory could give: peace of mind. By late summer, the distance between the guards and the women had almost vanished. The barbed wire still stood. The towers were still manned. But something invisible had changed. They no longer looked at each other through fear, but through understanding. The Americans had seen prisoners before: men, soldiers, officers, but never women. And these women were unlike any they'd imagined: polite, disciplined, even graceful in the smallest movements. Some of the guards said quietly, "They remind me of home." It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it wasn't hatred anymore either. One afternoon, an American sergeant walked past the laundry area and saw a group of women struggling to hang heavy blankets on the line. He stopped, took off his jacket, and helped them lift it. The women froze, unsure how to react. No man had done something for them without expecting anything in return since before the war. After a moment, one whispered, "Danke." The sergeant smiled, nodded, and simply said, "You're welcome." It was a small act, but in a world that had forgotten kindness, it meant everything. Little by little, small exchanges began to happen. A guard shared a cigarette. A prisoner gave him a paper flower she'd made from a newspaper. Another woman traded a handkerchief she had sewn for a stick of gum. The Americans would bring newspapers, sometimes candy, sometimes nothing at all, just a smile and a few words. No one ordered them to do it. They just did. They treated us as people, not property, one woman wrote later. I learned that strength can look like gentleness. The camp's language barrier became thinner every day. English words mixed with German ones in broken sentences, gestures filling in the blanks. Laughter replaced suspicion. Some guards asked questions. "Where in Germany are you from?" One woman pointed to a map drawn in the dirt, showing her town, now nothing but ruins. The guard listened quietly, then showed her a photo of his own home. Green fields, a white fence, a smiling wife. They stood for a moment in silence, two lives separated by an ocean, but joined by the same ache for peace. The Americans began to let small freedoms in. Women could walk the inner grounds without escort, visit the gardens, even attend outdoor prayers. One morning, a guard brought his guitar and sat near the fence, playing soft tunes while the women washed clothes. When he finished, one of the women clapped, the first applause he'd heard in months. He smiled, embarrassed, but kept playing. That evening, he found a note left on the fence written in shaky English. "Thank you for music. We have not heard something beautiful in long time." Of course, not everyone approved. Some officers warned their men to keep distance. Rumors spread about smiles, about looks, about kindness that might be seen as weakness. But even those who tried to stay cold couldn't ignore the warmth that filled the camp. One American lieutenant later said, "You can't guard people every day without seeing yourself in them." They stopped being the enemy a long time before they left. There were no uprisings, no fights, no discipline problems. The camp functioned on something far stronger than fear: mutual respect. The women followed the rules not because they were forced to, but because they felt treated fairly. In return, the Americans lowered their voices, softened their posture, and began to see these prisoners not as captured enemies, but as survivors, just like themselves. As autumn came, the guards noticed something remarkable. The women had started teaching each other English songs. They sang softly while working, their voices rising like a memory of life before the war. The men on duty listened quietly, and when the day ended, some of them found themselves humming the same melodies. They reminded us, one soldier wrote later, that the world could still sound gentle. By the end of 1945, the camp no longer felt like a prison. The fences still stood, but inside, life had settled into something almost normal. There was work, laughter, music, and now, learning. The Americans brought books and chalkboards. At first, they were meant for discipline and communication, but soon the women asked for something more: lessons. They wanted to understand the world that had defeated them, and, more importantly, the world that had treated them kindly. Every afternoon after chores, small groups gathered in the recreation hall. An American sergeant and two nurses taught basic English, words like bread, water, thank you, freedom. The women copied them carefully into small notebooks provided by the camp. They repeated the sounds, sometimes laughing at their own accents. "We spoke as if we were tasting a new language," one woman said. "It felt strange on the tongue, the words of the enemy. But they were gentle words. Learning English became more than study. It became a way of connecting, of crossing the invisible distance between fences and hearts." Eventually, the camp was allowed to send letters through the Red Cross. Each woman was given one sheet of paper and one envelope per month. The first time they held that paper, it felt like holding a piece of the outside world. Most didn't know what to write. How do you describe a prison that feels kinder than home? They began carefully. "I am alive. I am treated well. We have food and beds." But then came the harder truth, the one few dared to admit openly. They are not as we were told. Some of the letters were censored. Still, the message slipped through, quietly, invisibly, that the world outside Germany was not made of monsters, but of men. Through those months, something inside the women began to shift. The hatred that had once been fed to them by propaganda dissolved, replaced by a kind of quiet respect. They began to see the war from a distance, not as victory or defeat, but as madness. The guards, once faceless enemies, now had names. The country they had feared now had warmth, structure, and compassion. One woman wrote in her diary, "They beat us not with force, but with decency." I think that is the strongest kind of victory. As winter approached, rumors spread that many of them would soon be repatriated. Some cheered, others fell silent. America had begun to feel safe, almost like a dream they would soon wake from. The guards told them, "You will go home soon." But no one knew what home was anymore. They had come to America as prisoners. Now they were leaving as something else, witnesses to a truth they could never unsee, that humanity could exist even in the aftermath of hate. Before their departure, the women gathered to write one final letter together. It was never sent, but kept in the camp's archives. It said, "We came here afraid. We expected cruelty and pain, but you gave us soap, food, and peace. You gave us back the feeling of being women, not soldiers. When we return to our country, we will carry this memory with us. That kindness is stronger than war." The journey back to Germany began on a gray morning in early spring. The women stood beside the buses, holding small bundles of belongings. A few letters, a handkerchief, sometimes a bar of American soap they couldn't bear to leave behind. They looked around the camp one last time. The wooden barracks, the guards by the gate, the flag fluttering in the wind. No one cheered. No one cried out. There was only quiet gratitude and something that felt like loss. "We had entered as enemies," one woman later wrote, "and left as human beings." As they boarded the buses, the American guards stood lined along the road. Some waved, some saluted, some said, "Good luck," in clumsy German. The women smiled back, a few whispering, "Thank you," in English, the word they had learned, the one they would never forget. An American nurse, the same Mary who once gave out soap and lipstick, slipped a small package into one woman's hand. Inside was a folded photograph of the camp garden, blooming with daisies. On the back, she had written, "Don't forget that kindness grows anywhere." The bus engine roared to life, and just like that, their strange chapter in America ended. The ship home was different. No guards shouting, no fear of the unknown, only silence and reflection. The sea stretched endlessly, calm and gray, like the space between two worlds. The women spoke softly on deck, their faces older but calmer now. They shared stories of the camp, the food, the lessons, the laughter, and tried to imagine what waited for them beyond the horizon. Germany, home. But what would that even mean anymore? When they arrived, the country was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ashes. Trains ran through hollow stations. People moved like ghosts among ruins. Families reunited in silence. Others discovered there was no one left to return to. The women stood there clutching their few possessions, the soap, the notebooks, the memories. They had been prisoners in a foreign land, but now they felt like strangers in their own. Some tried to tell others what they had seen in America, but few wanted to listen. The idea that their captors had treated them with kindness didn't fit the story people wanted to believe. They called us liars, one woman recalled. They said we were brainwashed. But I had seen it, the smiles, the food, the music. I knew the truth. She kept the American soap hidden in a drawer for years, a quiet symbol of the world she had glimpsed, the one built on decency instead of hate. Years later, many of those women built new lives. Some married, some taught, some raised children. But in every story there was one memory that never faded, not the war, not the defeat, but the morning they stepped into a shower, trembling, and realized the water was warm. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't pity. It was respect. That small act, the gift of soap, food, and dignity, broke through the walls that propaganda had built. And long after the war was gone, it remained as proof that kindness can survive even in the darkest of times. The Americans gave us something we didn't know we needed, one survivor wrote in her final letter. They gave us back our humanity. The camp itself was dismantled years later. Grass grew over the paths where the women once walked, and flowers bloomed where the fences had stood. Only a few photos remain, black and white faces, faint smiles, hands holding tin cups. But behind every photograph lies the same invisible truth, that sometimes the greatest victory in war isn't won with weapons, but with kindness.